Good evening and welcome. This is the first session of Halakhah in Action, seh'eilah U-Teshuvot of the High Holiday Period with Rabbi Nati Helfgot, part of our Elul offerings at Drisha. This two-session series will explore common and not so common halakhic questions that arise during the period of Elul, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. We will examine how to unpack the elements of the seh'eilah and the differing approaches that can and are proffered as resolution or guidance in the case. We will explore topics on tefillah, customs, and when to violate the prescribed laws that arise in the real-life experiences of Jews, both past and present. It's very much a pleasure to be learning with Rabbi Nati, who has been teaching the Drisha for a long time, since the early 1990s, I believe.
Correct.
Yeah. And when he's not, teaching with us, he is the chair of the Department of Torah Shebaal Peh at SAR High School in New York City. And he is also the rabbi of Nativot Shalom in Teaneck, New Jersey. And we're really happy to have him. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to him.
Okay, thank you very much to those who are here and those who are going to show up late, and those who will listen to the shiur later on as it's recorded. And people sometimes like to listen to things afterwards, so it is recorded for posterity. Yes, Kayla, it is correct. I started teaching at Drisha in the early 1990s, when Drisha was an actual place with buildings and people that actually met with each other, and most of the time, there was no such thing as Zoom, obviously, but yes, it was a different time. But it's always wonderful to continue to teach with Drisha, and let me just get the sources up for myself, and I'm going to share the sources. So as Kayla introduced, this two-part series is going to deal with some kind of common questions that rabbis over the generations have gotten during Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, as well as certain new questions and new iterations of those questions that come up, especially in our context, and how different people have dealt with it over the years. So let's start with a very simple question that I'm asked all the time, and in fact, something that goes back for me a long time ago, and that is, slichot can be very challenging for people. Slichot are early in the morning or late at night, and they're, especially on Erev Rosh Hashanah, they're very long, and people don't find always that they can understand the meaning, and especially they don't necessarily understand the texts, and especially at the pace that many people go at when they do the slichot. And so over the years, I've been asked, is it appropriate to shorten the slichot, and is it right? So here, it's very straightforward question. That's number one on the source sheet. Ha'im mutar lekatzer baslichot? Is it permitted? And the answer is also very straightforward. There's no question you can shorten the slichot. Very famous statement in the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Aleph Seif Dalid. When it comes to things like slichot, kinot, tachanun, tov lomar ma'at tachanunim beharbe kavana milaharbot beli kavana. It's better to say a little bit of tachanunim, a little bit of slichot and prayers, supplication, than to say a lot with kavana, than to say a lot without kavana. This is probably one of the reasons, if everyone, today, it's very common in many synagogues when it comes to keynote on Tisha B'Av, that the kahila does not say all of the keynote. I don't know. I've been davening in many shuls over my life, and almost none of them ever said every single thing that's in the keynote booklet. How come? First of all, historically, we should know that, especially before, for many hundreds of years, the idea of the keynote booklet or the slichot booklet was not necessarily the idea that you have to say every single thing in the booklet. The idea was that you would have a range of slichot and keynote that the shaliach tzibur, that the chazan would choose from, and every year he might choose some different ones. But it didn't necessarily imply that he had to say everything, especially at a time when many people did not necessarily say them themselves, but were simply engaged in response. They did the response, right? Many of the slichot, especially let's say the pizmonim, the ones that have a chorus, probably were not said by the kahal. They were said by the shliach tzibur, and then there was a response. If you notice, even last night, Saturday night, if you went to slichot, if you're Ashkenazi, you'll notice that some of the slichot are actually only written for the chazan, where they talk about. It's almost like on Rosh Hashanah, it's like Rosh Hashanah Kippur. It's a hineni ha'ani. It's a prayer to ask to allow me to come before God. So originally they weren't all said. At some point, especially in German kihilot, the custom became that you say everything that's printed in the book, and it became a very long service. But the Shulchan Aruch says very clearly, and that's the source. I definitely think, especially one of the pioneers of this idea was Rabbi Soloveitchik in Boston, that he took keynote and turned keynote into a learning opportunity. Instead of saying every single last 50 keynote that are printed in the Ashkenazi Rite, he said 10 during the course of 5 or 6 hours and explained them, used them as a springboard to discuss ideas of Jewish history, of Jewish theology. And the same thing should apply to slichot. And in fact, most schools that I know do that as well. They shorten the slichot. I'm not sure why shuls don't do it, but they certainly, I believe, should do it, especially on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Since I was in college, I personally have always tried to organize a minyan where we say about 10 or 12 slichot on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and then move on, because to say 50 slichot very quickly, I think for many people, and especially for me, is kind of meaningless and doesn't achieve the goal. Just to finish on this point, Rav Hutner, the great Rosh Hashiva of Chaim Berlin, who is a very sharp person, used to say the following. It says in the Shulchan Aruch, Tov lomar ma'at tachanunim b'harbei kavanah. It is good to say a little bit of penitential prayers with a lot of kavanah, with a lot of intent, milaharbot b'li kavanah, as opposed to saying a lot of it with little intent. Rav Hutner went one step further, and he jokingly said, Tov lomar ma'at tachanunim b'ma'at kavana mi lomar harbe tachanunim ma'at kavana. It's better to say a little bit of slichot with no kavana than to say a lot of slichot with no kavana. Next, another question that people ask all the time, and I get this question, especially people who have other responsibilities, security responsibilities, family responsibilities. In their community, there's no early slichot, so they can't go to slichot. Are they allowed to say slichot by themselves without a minyan? This was a classic question, and this also came up in throughout Jewish history. There were communities that didn't have a minyan, or people were working, or people were in different places. So the truth is that what we know as slichot on Rosh Hashanah and Aseret Yimei Tshuva and the days before Slichot is actually borrowed from a different halakhic paradigm. Meaning, if you look in the early sources for example, in Chazal and the Talmud, there is no mention of reciting Slichot during the month of Elul. There is no mention of reciting Slichot during Aseret Yimei Tshuva. There are other halachot that are mentioned. You change the text of the prayer of the Amidah, where you say Zachreinu l'chaim, Melech hafetz b'chaim, or you say, which goes back to the Gaonic period, but you change it to Melech HaKadosh, HaMelech HaKadosh, and you change it to HaMelech HaMishpat. So that is in the Talmud. Zachreinu l'chaim and the additions that we make, those come from the early Gaonic period, but it's not clear exactly when the Slichot were introduced into the liturgy. But Slichot actually does exist in a different model, and that exists in the Gemara and in the Rishonim, originally in the context of fasting. There are fast days. There's a whole phalanx of fast days that we have during the course of the Jewish year, but there's also fast days that we don't really do anymore today, but the Talmud has an entire tractate devoted, Masechet Ta'anit, devoted to fasts, occasional fasts that the tzibor is allowed to institute, the community is allowed to institute when there is no rain, or when there's war, or when there's pestilence, or terrible things are going on. And on those fast days, you added penitential prayers. And those are where the origin of slichot comes from. The original custom, according to many, was that they actually said the slichot in the middle of Shemona Esrei, just like the original custom was probably to say some of the keynote, the elegies on Tisha B'Av in the middle of Shemona Esrei. Now, in the context of slichot on Tisha B'Av, and again, I want to remind everybody that, parenthetically, that whole idea of slichot is connected to fast days. We'll explain in a few minutes. I'll explain something regarding that, something about the origin of our custom today. So the second question I posed here in my source sheet: Ha'im yachid yachol hagid slichot latzmo b'li minyan? Is a person allowed to say slichot to themselves without a minyan? So if you look in the Tur, you look in the 14th century commentary, the Tur writes, Katav Rav Natan, she'ein minhag liyachid hamitaneh lomar yid gimel midot. The custom, says Rav Natan, one of the later Geonim, is that the custom is that an individual does not say Yud Gimel Midot. So the custom in his locale, in the Gaonic period, was that an individual does not recite the 13 principles of mercy. The implication is that everything else around the slichot, the piyutim, the beautiful, texts of penitential prayers, or other things, you're allowed to recite. He says, I don't know. What's the big deal? What's the problem of saying it b'yechidut? It's not kaddish. It's not kedusha. Sharei eino ella kikorei b'Torah. It's simply that he is studying Torah, meaning he's saying words. What's the big deal? Shaharei lo amru chachamim ela kol davar shebikudusha kagon kadisha kedusha baruch. What's the big deal of saying the Yud Gimel midot harachamim, the 13 attributes of faith? This continues, and what's interesting is that the Rashba, already in the 1200s, late 1200s, he does adopt that stance. So the Rashba writes, Katav Rabbi Natan she'ein minhag liyachid hamitaneh lomar Yud Gimel midot. He's cited by the Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, that Rav Natan says the minhag is not to recite Yud Gimel midot. Kachi data Rashba shekatav b'tshuva mistabra dechol she'omra derech tefillah bakashot rachamim. If you're davening slichot, ein nemarim b'yachid the davar shebikdusha hein. It's an amazing concept. The Rashba creates a new category and claims that when we say the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, when we say the 13 attributes of mercy, they are similar to a Davar Shebekadusha. They're like Kaddish, Kedusha, Kriyas HaTorah. They require a minyan. That's an amazing, really. And his proof is from an Agadita. His proof is from a section in the Gemara. Moshe Amru, Rosh Hashanah, Ba'agada, Nitatef HaKadosh Baruch Hu K'shliach Tzibor. When the Talmud describes that the presentation, the revelation of the 13 principles of faith by God to Moses after the sin of the golden calf, so the Gemara in its presentation presents it as if God wrapped himself up in a talit like a chazan, like a shaliach tzibur, like a chazan. So he takes this agadita so seriously that you're a shliach tzibur, that you need a tzibur. That's an amazing jump. And therefore, he suggests that you really shouldn't say slichot in yechidut. However, there's an out. If you're not saying them in a penitential form, that you're praying to God, you just say them because you want to learn the meaning of the 13 principles. Just like when we recite in when we recite in Birkot Kriyat Shema, we recite the Kedusha, and we talk about what the angels say. So we're simply recording what the angels say. It's not a big deal. The Shulchan Aruch paskins, Ein hayachid rashai lomar 13 midot derech tefillah b'akashat rachamim the davar shebekdushaim. He follows the Rashba, but he limits it to the 13 principles. Aval im ba'al omram derech kriya ba'alma omrim. But if you want to just say them without any connotation that you're engaged in prayer, then it's okay. The Ramah goes even further. The Ramah says we take this like we make a fence around the law. You shouldn't say any slichot b'yachidut. And the Mishnah Brura, in commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, says that you're allowed to say them derech kriya b'te'amim. You have to say them with the trup. That makes it that you're not saying it as tefillah. Rav Moshe Feinstein goes even further in terms of being lenient, and he says, "Rashai hu likro benigun, shehu ragil likrot belimudo tam psakim shelo yireh kemit palel." The word shelo is it's a mistake there. Rav Moshe says, as long as you're not praying with them with the Yud Gimel Midot, it's okay. Now, it's very weird. Isn't that the whole reason why you want to say the Yud Gimel Midot is because they're penitential and you want to invoke God's mercy? So what does it mean that you want to say them without davening? There are others. Again, this seems to be the mainstream approach. Again, there are those, and I think many people rely on the view that was articulated by Rabbi Natan, who says, I don't understand how it's a davar shebikdusha. I don't understand. And even though the Shulchan Aruch rules this way, I think there are many people who kind of take Rav Moshe's, the Igrot Moshe, to say that only the issue is by the Yud Gimel Midot. And so I know many people who will certainly say slichot, but they won't say the Yud Gimel Midot. They'll just say the slichot, and that's the custom. I do want to mention in passing this business of a fast day and slichot is very important to understand the custom of Ashkenazim. As we all know, the Sfaradim started to say slichot a month ago. 3 weeks ago, at the beginning of Elul, which makes sense on some level. The beginning of Elul is the time it's the beginning of a penitential season, and it's a time when we add certain prayers and we start to think. But that's a Sephardi custom. The minhag Ashkenaz is a very strange minhag. The minhag Ashkenaz, the Ashkenazi custom, is we start slichot on the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah, as long as we have 4 days before Rosh Hashanah. So if Rosh Hashanah falls out on a Wednesday night, then it's okay, because we have Saturday night, which is Yom Rishon, we have Sunday night, which is Yom Sheni, we have Monday night, which is Yom Shlishi, and we have Tuesday night, which is Yom Revi'i. So Saturday night, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night. So we have 4 days prior to Rosh Hashanah. However, if there are less than 4 days before the beginning of the week, we shoot it back to the previous week. Like this year. This year, Rosh Hashanah comes out on a Monday night. So it's Tuesday, Wednesday. So we shoot the Ashkenazi custom back to the beginning of this week, last night. Why? It's very strange. What's this business? So the answer is very straightforward. The answer is that as much as we sometimes like to believe that the Sephardi customs are always the more authentic or original customs, I actually think that when it comes to the original custom, probably the Ashkenazi custom is more original. Why? Because as I said before, the original custom of saying slichot is borrowed from the world of fasting, from the world of fast days. And it seems that we have a number of indications that in the Gaonic period, there were people who would fast every day of Aseret Yimei Tshuva, that they were able to fast. They would fast between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, except the days that you were not allowed to fast. What are the days you're not allowed to fast, according to Jewish tradition? The 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, Shabbat Shuvah, and Erev Yom Kippur, where not only is it forbidden to fast, it's a mitzvah to eat. So there seems to have been a custom, a notion developed that you should have 10 fast days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, including Yom Kippur. Now, when you experience the calendar, you can't actually have 10 fast days because you can't fast. And when I mean fast days, I don't mean like Yom Kippur fasts. I mean like Ramadan fasts. You eat early in the morning, you go and you don't eat during the day. You eat at night. That kind of a fast, just like what we call like Yud Zayin B'Tam was kind of fast. So how do you make up for 10 days of fasting? You make up by having 4 days prior to Rosh Hashanah where you fast. And if you fast, you say slichot. So you extended the slichot to another 4 days. When you don't have 4 days before Rosh Hashanah that week, you want to ensure you have 4 days. So why don't you start in the middle of the week? You don't start in the middle of the week because you don't want people to get confused. So you always start at the beginning of a week. So this is what the original Ashkenazi custom developed from, and this is what we today we have a remnant of that. We don't like fasting anymore. We're kind of satiated with the fasts that we have. And so the slichot, the fasting disappeared, but the slichot remained. Okay, that's an aside about our custom today. What is the correct time to say slichot? This was always a very big issue, and it continues till today. It brings out a lot of debate and discussion within the Jewish community. Again, if you look carefully in Maimonides, and this again shows me that this was the original minhag, Maimonides does not mention anything about starting to say slichot on the first day of Elul. But this is what he says. Umipnei inyan zeh, because of this is in Hilchot Teshuvah, Perek Gimel, 3rd chapter of Hilchot Teshuvah. Umipnei inyan zeh nagu kol beit Yisrael, because of the idea that during this period of time, God is close to the Jewish people and he is open to hear our prayers. To use the Hasidic terminology, Hamelech Basadeh, that God is now, the king is in the field, he is more accessible. Therefore, during this period of time, what's the period of time? Rosh Hashanah v'ad Yom Kippurim. The Jewish people have a custom, all of the house of Israel, to add and increase tzedakah, good deeds, and do mitzvot. Rosh Hashanah ad Yom Kippurim yetem mikol yimot hashana, more than all days of the year. V'nhagu kulam lakum balayla ba'aseret yamim elu. The custom is to get up in the night during these days. Ulitpalel bebatei knesiot b'divrei tachnunim b'divrei kibushim ad sheyeh or hayom. The custom is to get up in the night and to daven in the shuls and with words of penitence and words of reproof ad sheyeh or hayom, until the day breaks. Now, when you read Maimonides, it's very clear that Maimonides has a very specific model in mind. First of all, as I said, it's only during Aseret Yimei Tshuva that you add, during the 10 days of penitence, that you say divrei tachnonim, what we call slichot, words of penitence. Number 2, you get up in the night. Getting up in the night here does not mean like in the middle of the night, at 1 a.m, the way many people try to do it. Also, people don't get up at 1 o'clock. They're already up. It means that in their society, right, without electricity, you went to sleep a little bit after the sunset and darkness, and you said Kriyat Shema, you went to sleep, and you got up with the crack of dawn. Here, you're getting up when it's still dark outside. You're getting up before the crack of dawn, and you're adding prayer, and you're supposed to daven, I don't know, another half hour until the day breaks. That's the ideal model for Maimonides. So if you ask me what's the ideal model of the original sources is that you go to sleep. And again, in their day and age, they went to sleep, whatever. They went to sleep at, 8 o'clock at night. You get up at 5 in the morning, and dawn is at 5:30, 5:45, and you start to daven slichot. The Shulchan Aruch seems to say the same thing. The simple reading, noagim lakum ba'ashmoret. Ashmoret here means by the time the Shulchan Aruch is using this term, Ashmoret refers to the last third of the night, to say slichot, mirosh chodesh Elul ve'elach ad Yom Kippurim. Now, why during the evening? So what's interesting, for Maimonides, notice there is no kind of Kabbalistic, Rambam wasn't a Kabbalist, Kabbalistic notion. It's simply because you want to pray extra. So if generally you get up with the dawn and you daven at 6 o'clock in the morning at dawn, so to daven a little early, you want to show that you want to add to your prayers and you want to connect to God more. So you get up at 5:30. But what's interesting is by the time this trickles down to the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries, of course, something has happened, and that is the great revolution of Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic system, which took the night and different parts of the night as reflecting different times when we are close to God or farther from God, where certain times during the night the demonic powers are functioning, and certain times of the night the more chesed, God's attributes of mercy, are functioning. And so the Magen Avraham, who is not necessarily Kabbalist, but he's already living in a world which is suffused with the Kabbalistic notions, will write something like, Mipnei shakadosh baruch hu shat, God is swimming, whatever that means, biyud elef olamot, in the 18,000 worlds that exist, ubesof halayla, and at the end of the night, shat be'olam hazeh, God comes back to swim in our world. V'hu eit ratzon, it is a time of favor. So this is a Kabbalistic notion based on Zoharistic principles and developed in even greater detail in the Ari HaKadosh, in Rav Yitzchak Luria and his Talmidim, Rav Moshe Zakuta and others, where the idea of the latter part of the night is not because you're just davening right before you get up, but it's rather that this is the auspicious time to connect to God on a Kabbalistic level. Now, if you're not a Kabbalist, so, okay. But this is a fascinating area where Kabbalah, because it was not necessarily in conflict with Halakhah, sometimes Kabbalistic notions and halakhic notions sometimes come into conflict, and then you have to decide, are you more of a Kabbalist, more of a halachist? What is going to be the dominant, what's going to be the controlling precedent, text, minhag? Here, you don't really have anything in conflict directly, halachically, and so the Kabbalah won out in the sources, and people started making sure that you daven right before in the morning. However, of course, what happens is that it becomes formalized. And so what you find in the Kabbalistic sources is the second half of the night is an auspicious time. The best time of the night is right before dawn, that last third of the morning. But after Chatzot is already the time when God's mercies are imagined. And so you start to find, and especially as people start to stay up later, the introduction of coffee, people staying up later at night, and especially as people move in to the more modern period, even the pre-modern period, where people are staying up later at night, you find this phenomenon of people starting to want to say slichot at night before they go to sleep, which is, of course, not at all what was intended by Maimonides and the original creators of the slichot, which was that it should be conjoined to the prayers. And so what's interesting is you find pushback. So I wanted to show you two teshuvot, two responsa, which till today kind of control the discussion around this issue. And then I wanted to show you a tshuva from a contemporary rabbi who is not so well known in this area, but who I think makes a lot of sense conceptually. So the first person, so Rav Moshe Feinstein in 1960, and you have to remember, 1960 is a time of great urban change. Neighborhoods are starting to change. Inner city neighborhoods are becoming a little bit more dangerous. People are starting to become more afraid to go out late at night. And so the custom that had developed by this time of people going to slichot after chatzot, 1 in the morning, 1:30 in the morning, in some areas was starting to get problematic. So Rav Moshe is asked, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great American posek, is asked in 1960, Tafshin Chaf, what happens kishiyesh ones lo yuchlu lomar b'ashmoret? What happens when it's an onus, you're forced, you're not able to say slichot in the ashmor. Hinei b'dvar amirat slichot. So we're going to read just a couple of choice lines from this very lengthy tshuva. I didn't print the whole tshuva, but even from the part I printed, I want to just read some key lines. Hinei b'dvar amirat slichot bimkom sheyireim lalechet. People are afraid b'shamu cheret balayla. There's crime, there's fear. Are you allowed to say slichot before chatzot? Ukvot tarato, and you, my honored, distinguished interlocutor, you rotzeladun dekema dehatam shomrim bashmor. Once you take the Kabbalistic notion that the reason you start saying slichot in the latter part of the night, hu mishum sha'azu ate ratzon, because then it is a time of favor. Kid'ita magen Avram imkain. So let's put the point. Habitzibur beit hakneset who ate ratzon lo'olam. The Talmud says that when you daven bitzibur, when you daven in a community, in a minyan, and you daven in a beit knesset, it's ate ratzon. It's the ideal. God always is listening. Kedita bebrachot avchet. He says, avalaniu daiti. Rav Moshe says, in my opinion, avshalach ora davar nachon. Even though your svara is very cogent, you see that for hundreds of years, even though your svara is correct, that to daven in a minyan and to daven in a shul is already gives you a quote-unquote advantage, it's clear that the Jewish practice was that people would go and daven in the middle of the night. And you should have added V'gam ha ba'asar yamim mirosh Hashanah Kippur ate ratzon. We know that this period of time is even greater, ate ratzon, that God afli yachid, and mikol bakom af ba'asar yamei tshuva omrim slichot ba'ashmoret. You see, still the custom developed that you said slichot in the early morning, and so therefore Rav Moshe says ideally you should say it that way. He says, if it's indeed not possible to do it at 1 a.m, halakhic midnight, and the tzibur would not be able to do slichot, you can permit this as a temporary measure to do it. And here you see the Lithuanian come out in Rav Moshe. Ki b'dvarim elu, in these things, ein makor b'Gemara. There's no real source in the Gemara that you have to say slichot in the latter part of the evening after chatzot. Elahim divrei rabotenu harachronim. It all comes from the achronim, the Magen Avram, the Ari HaKadosh, al pi sifrei HaKabbalah, based on the Kabbalah. Shemistaber she'ein bazeh inyan isur. it must be, it's not that there's some sort of prohibition, it's just, it's a nice thing to daven, and you get greater brownie points in heaven if you daven, you say slichot before then, and that God will listen to your prayer better, and therefore it's not the end of the world. Okay, this is Rav Moshe, and so Rav Moshe basically, interestingly enough, is willing to say on a svara level, there really makes no sense that any of the time should be better than the other when you're davening with a minyan, and especially during Aseret Yimei Tshuva, and especially in a shul. But that's the custom that developed, and we should apply that custom. If a person is an onus, if a person can't do it, so you could, and based on this tshuva, many shuls till today, when they know that many people will not daven slichot unless they have a early minyan at 10:30 at night, they do that, and that's very common in America, in many communities. On the other hand, Rav Ovadia Yosef, in a very sharp tshuva in Yechavedat, interestingly enough, or his collection, his 7-volume collection of short tshuvot. He has very long tshuvot called Yabia Omer. The Yechavedat are short tshuvot that originated on the radio. In the early 1970s, Rabbi Yosef had a very popular corner on Kol Yisrael when there were only 2 or 3 stations in Israel. And every Friday he had Pinata Halakhah. And he would take questions, people submitted in advance, kind of very common questions in Halakhah, and he would take one and speak for about 10-15 minutes. Eventually he wrote these tshuvot down as Yechavedat. So he was asked, somebody is tired, they can't get up early in the morning, what do they do in terms of slichot? What do they do in terms of slichot? So Rav Ovadia is not very lenient here at all. It's based on the Zohar. But for him, it's not just that. It's not just that in the early hours, it's 8 ratzon, but he goes even further. He takes the Kabbalistic notion even further. In the morning hours before you daven, there's the kochot chesed, the divine attributes of mercy. That aspect of God is showing up. In the morning, God shows His chesed. But in the evening, from mincha time until chatzot, he says, mitorerim midot hadin. It's not just that it's not ideal, but somehow the aspects of God's more harsh judgment are developing. And based on this, and certain Kabbalistic sources, like Rabbi Moshe Zakut B'Tshuva, and he said, Al Pi HaKabbalah, and he said, because during this time, Ki Az Hu ate hit gabrut hadinim. This is the time between mincha and chatzot, between mincha and midnight, when the forces of God's more judgment-like qualities emerge. And therefore, listen to this, ubahazkarat aslichot yud gimel midot arachmim shel vayavor ba'oto shah anu nir'im kemitgarim bahem umevakshim limnoa pulatam. It's as if we're poking the bear. We're poking the bear of God's attributes of judgment, and we're trying to say, you don't get a chance to do your thing. It's a very Kabbalistic notion. And we are somehow stirring jealousy amongst these divine powers, and we could really end up in a bad place. So it's not just that it's not a nice thing and you don't get the same brownie points, but you're really somehow challenging God's attributes, and it's a bad thing to do. And therefore, Rav Ovadia, if I skip, what does he say? If you can't say slichot before shachrit, yicholim lomar slichot lifnei tfilat mincha. Rav Ovadia says it's better to say slichot. If you can't say it before chatzot at night, it's better to say slichot, and you can't say it in the morning. It's better to say slichot during the day before mincha. Wow. This is the two extreme positions. I wanted to show you that a modern tshuva that points out that Rav Ovadia Yosef's ideas, which are totally based on Kabbalah, and again, it's interesting because generally Rav Ovadia is not such a big Kabbalist, especially when Kabbalah comes to conflict with Halakhah, but it may be that when it doesn't come into conflict with Halakhah, and especially when it comes to tefillot, Rav Ovadia is much more willing to grant Kabbalah dominion. So Rav Yoel bin Nun, who's better known as a Tanachist, as a great scholar of Tanakh, is also writes teshuvot from time to time. And he wrote a tshuva where he doesn't understand Rav Ovadia at all. He says, today, what we do is einenu minhag kadum. What most people do is not at all the original minhag. Mipnei sheruvam einam kamim mashmor taboker. Most people don't get up at 5 in the morning. There are people who get up at 5 in the morning in Israel. There are. Most people get up 10 minutes earlier, 15 minutes earlier than they usually get up. And then they say, okay, and they end up, he says, you take the essence into something secondary, in the secondary. You end up saying slichot for 25 minutes, tefillah, and davening takes 20 minutes. It should have been better to just say a couple of slichot after Shmona Esrei. Okay. Number 2, he says there are some people that say slichot after chatzot because of the words of the Ari. But then they go to sleep. You stay up till 1 in the morning, then you say slicha, then you go to sleep. That's not the minhag at all, because the whole idea was to daven early, to start your davening early, not to say it and then go to sleep for 6 hours. Then you go to sleep. And then he says a third problem. I meet people who are very tired. And if the totza'ah of staying up till 1 every night for 30 days is that you're tired, and when you're driving, you're not as sharp and you might endanger yourself or other people. You go to your workplace. You're not working at top efficiency and you're stealing, in effect. Or you're not going to study properly. Or you're not going to teach properly. And you're not going to daven properly. Al yashkim kum l'slichot. She'ein minhag slichot omeid mul kol eileh. The whole idea of slichot doesn't make any sense. And he says, the whole thing makes no sense for us today, because again, in the time of the Gaonim, when this minhag started, and even the time of the Kabbalists, people would go to sleep at 8 o'clock at night and get up at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning, and then it made sense. He says, but today, he says, because of electricity and light, electric light, everything has changed. Until electricity, people would sleep most of their sleep early in the night, and then they would get up at 3, 4 in the morning. And they had slept properly, and then they get up early. However, once they discovered electricity, that's not what's happening. Most people sleep the second half of the night. right? We stay up till 10, 11, 12 o'clock, and then we sleep the second half of the night. That's when we sleep. And therefore, dafka in the early part of the night is when we're awake. And so Rav Yoel says the ideal is to go back to the original minhag, which is we should daven, say slichot, if you can. He says, Zman ra'ui l'slichot al pi minhagu b'ashkamat haboker l'fnei tfilat vatikin. If you always daven vatikin, it makes sense. However, aval tzibur shemitpalalim if you don't want to mess up your study, your tefillah, your driving, it's at the beginning of the night. And we should try to do it somewhere around 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And that's when you should do it. Because that's the ideal, and that's certainly what emerges from the original thing, and especially if you're davening in a shul. Okay. The next issue that people ask me all the time, and especially as a rabbi who's guiding chazanim, are you allowed to repeat words? This has become a big issue, depending on your shul, etc. Can you repeat words in davening? So the truth is that if you look in the Mishnah and the Gemara don't really talk about repeating words as a thing, except for theological reasons. So there's a very famous Mishnah in Brachot, which says, "Ha'omer al kan sipor yagi rachamecha." If a person says that God's mercy is coming upon the nest of birds because he commanded us to send away the baby birds, the implication is that only this mitzvah is rachamim. Or he says modim. He says modim twice. Mishtatkin oto. You shut him down. You close him down. Amar Rab Zera. Why? Kola omer shma shma ka omer modim dami. It's as if you said modim. And the Gemara explains, without getting into all the details, Rashi and Tosfos here, we just don't have enough time. The Gemara explains because it sounds like you're doing, that you are accepting upon yourself two gods, dualism. Modim. You're a Zoroastrianist. You believe in this God and you believe in that God. I guess if you say it 3 times, you believe in the Trinity. So it's a problem. But in the Talmud, there is no problem per se with repeating words. It's only specific words that might imply a theological problem. Maybe you could expand it to other places. Maybe Shem Hashem, maybe to repeat God's name a lot might be a problem, but that's it. In fact, we all know from our practice that we have a number of instances where we repeat words in davening. According to the Halakhah, in Hallel, we say, Ana, and we say, Odecha ki ani tani vahili shua, Odecha. In the Tehillim, it's only once, but we repeat it twice because the Gemara says, B'makom shekoflin. That was the minhag, was to double it. That was part of the shirah, part of the song. Already in the time of the Talmud, it was clear that people repeated words for emphasis. They repeated words to get themselves into the mood, whatever the reason, but people repeated words. That was it's not a modern phenomenon in song. And so, there is a school of thought which says there's no problem with repeating words. The only words you shouldn't repeat are theological words, and maybe Shem Hashem. And this certainly was the custom, and continues to be the custom in many synagogues, where chazanim repeat words, people repeat words, especially if it's to enhance their kavanah, enhance them. And clearly, it's not considered an interruption. It's not considered a hefsek. It's not mentioned in the Talmud that that's a hefsek, especially since you're involved in the tefillah. What's interesting is that when you get to the period of the Achronim, that's when it starts to really heat up. And you start to find the halachists are not interested, and in fact push back against a lot of the chazanim. And so there's a very famous tshuva of the Maharam Shik. Maharam Shik was a student of the Chatam Sofer in Hungary. He was one of the leading rabbis in Hungary in the mid-19th century, when, of course, a lot of exciting things were going on in Hungary, nationalism, as well as the split within the traditional Jewish community between the neologues and the Orthodox, and repeating words for some reason became a big deal. Again, maybe it was something that was being done by the more modern chazanim, and this was also a pushback by the traditionalists. But one thing is clear is that he is very much opposed to this idea of adding words. And he develops, and he says, he was sent a question from this rabbi, from this place. Michtavo kibalti ubikesh meni lachavot dati al davar chazanim shemizamrim v'koflim tevot. They sing and they repeat words. Harbe pe'amim bizmiratam levasem kolam, in order to show how beautiful their voice is. Im ze asur midina, is it asur? Ki hachazan shebekilato kofel machpila tevot v'charuzim afilu betfilat shmona esrei kedusha. Even during Shmona Esrei. And he believes exactly the proof that I brought, he brings against what I said. He says the fact that the Talmud only discusses repeating words in Hallel and nowhere else tells you that you shouldn't repeat words anywhere else. So the same source can be both a source. So he writes that there are 5 reasons why you shouldn't repeat words. He says, number 1, Mishum Bal Tosif, which is a very creative argument. He says it's a violation of the biblical prohibition of adding to the mitzvot, which is a real stretch. Usually we think of adding to the mitzvot like you do a 9th day of Pesach, you do a 9th day of Sukkot, you take 5 of the minim, you take 5 of the species, or you say you add another verse to the Birkat Kohanim, to the priestly blessing. But here, to say that it's Baal Tosef is a tremendous chiddush, but that's his first argument. I think it's a very weak argument. His second argument is Yesh lomar di mosif b'kedusha. If you add words in kedusha by repeating the words, Havi kidover shkarim, it's as if you're lying before God. You say, as they do up there, and it's not true. Up in heaven, the angels don't repeat words. They just say it. So you're lying. That's a very cute kind of argument. Third argument, Lefiani yudaiti havi hefsek. It's considered a hefsek, an interruption in the prayer, which is a chiddush. Because in general, a hefsek is either where you say things that have nothing to do with the prayer, or you simply stop and don't continue doing your prayer. So to say that this is a hefsek, that this is considered, is a chiddush. It's a novel idea that's introduced by this achron. Number 4, he says they turn the davening into like a show. They turn it into music, into a musical, into kimin zemer. And he quotes in Agadita that, God chastises people who do that. And number 5, he says, we know that the prophet often will compare coming before God to coming before a king, an earthly king. And would anybody come before an earthly king and stutter like that and say, I want, 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 I want. You wouldn't do that. So it's a very creative tshuva. I think that it's not very strong in terms, if you actually analyze it from a purely halakhic basis, it's not a very strong tshuva, but it certainly shows you the strength of the sense that this is not something that was finding favor in the eyes of this rabbi. It's interesting that 50 years later in Russia, you have the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Chil Michal Epstein, writing. He wants to. He talks about on Shabbat. He talks about. Listen, this is even worse. He says, "V'dad al pi ma shebiyanu la yesh lomod ez zchut al ma shavotenu rabim," because of our sins for many years. Shepastam mispachad etzel chazanim. You have this terrible thing, this terrible disease amongst the chazanim. She'ochazim biyadem mazleg katan shel kesef. They have a tuning fork on the bima. Shel eshet barzel. Shekorim kamer tone. Be'omda lifnei hamaud b'shabbatot v'yamim tovim. And they use the. So he wants to defend that. And then he says, Gam ma she'omrim atevot v'koflim. They come and repeat the words and triple the words. All the righteous, all the frum people are very upset about this. Because they say this is Oneg Shabbos, Oneg Yantif, they love Chazanis. Maybe there's no Isser. Meaning, he says, because you only find that the rabbi said someone who says Shema, Shema, or Modim, Modim. But maybe if they don't do that, it's okay. And the same thing you find amongst the later, you find Rav Moshe and Rav Ovadia try to be Melamed Zchut and try to show that it's not that it's not the terrible thing. And so you find that all of a sudden you find all kinds of poskim that start to be more lenient about it. Okay, so next time in 2 weeks, we are going to finish a little bit about the tefillot. I'll come back to this and just finish this topic very quickly. And then we're going to concentrate on Yom Kippur. We're going to concentrate on real difficult questions that I've been asked regarding people who have anorexia and fasting and other issues related to fasting on Yom Kippur, and some other questions that emerge regarding Yom Kippur and tefillot that come up on a regular basis every year. And that will be our second installment about seh'eilot that really come up from the beginning of time about Yom Kippur till today, that constantly kind of morph. And we'll do that Emir Tashem in 2 weeks. I want to wish everybody a chag, not a chag kasher v'sameach, but a shana tova mutuka, ktiva v'chatima tova.
All right, and thank you everyone for joining this week. See you in 2 weeks. There's more learning opportunities with Drisha, including one starting next week on next Sunday, Heavens Give Me Patience, Rabbi Ishmael, King Lear, and the Divine Tragedy with Gilo Fine. And you can sign up for this and more classes at drisha.org/classes. Take care, have a good night, and see you in the year to come.